Struggling with your career transition or pivot? Tune into this episode for expert tips on how to ace your next interview, identify your transferable skills, and communicate it in a way that resonates with your ideal employer. Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Hayley York, a career development specialist and founder of Illumination Career Development. She has an innate ability to connect with people, understand them, and to bring out the best in others to help them achieve their career goals. Having had the opportunity to work with multiple career coaches in the past, and then recently working with Hayley, I definitely felt a bigger difference because she helped me dig deep into what I valued and the value that I bring to others. So I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Hayley. So, how did you discover your passion or your niche?
I used to teach English as a foreign language, and I fell in love with teaching more than 25 years ago. And the other side of it was I always wanted to help people. And, I took me through health and safety and oil and gas, but in the last few years, it ended up becoming career coaching. And as you said, it is a real joy when I can help people feel more confident at the end of when we work together, and it helps them. It helps set them up for success going forward.
Amazing. And as you went through your career, what are some attributes of leaders that have played a key role in your success? Whether it's, I would never ever have those attributes as I continue on my career, or it's, hey, you know what, those are some amazing attributes that I want to be able to adopt in anything that I do.
I think it's the understanding of where a person's coming from that makes the big difference. So any supervisor who has actually sat down and said why they have a perspective or why asked me why mine is of a certain way, that's where the magic starts. It is about that tailored approach much more than the overall message. Focus on the business.
And I noticed that you have a tailored approach in your career coaching as well, right? Because I remember like telling some stories and then you were able to really unpack and be like, hey, like, have you ever noticed this? And I was like, no. And then you're like, it's probably because it comes naturally to you. So when you first started career coaching, like, how did you kind of design your framework in terms of how you approach coaching and why?
Why? I want to see confidence grow, and I want my clients to have a good set of tools, so resume, LinkedIn, and interviewing, they can use long after we work together. The approach is realistic. I am not about placating. I am about empowering success. I am about increasing your understanding of who you are and then how we shape that into results going forward. That's the real crux of it, I think. It's illuminating, right, where we came from, because it helps shape where we go next. And as a coach on a fundamental level, I coach to the level my clients are at. So I assess what they need, and that comes first.
I appreciate that because that context that each individual brings to a conversation matters a lot, right? Because if I'm here and you're already 50 miles ahead of me, I think you're setting me up for failure, essentially, right? Versus if you meet me where I'm at, I think that's cool. So, what is maybe one of the most common challenges you've seen individuals face as they prepare for a career transition?
Their own barriers. That's often the problem. I don't have anything special. I don't have anything unique. I hear that a lot, and that's complete baloney because everybody has that. And it's a combination of, how they've learned, how they've worked, and those competencies, but it's really who they were born as and discovering patterns of behavior and how you show up in any context.
So then if you were to reverse the roles, right? And someone were to say that to you, like, how do you start unpacking that way of thinking so that you can actually start actually coming from like a strengths-based like perspective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's understanding those behaviors. We need to define them, understanding. Then motivation for it. Why do I do that? Why do I call on this repeatedly? What would happen if I didn't do it? Asking some deeper questions. And then from there, it's about presenting it in terms of value to another person or another employer, audience, whoever that might be.
Okay, and speaking of that values piece, because that's one of the biggest things that you helped me with, right? Because it's that so what aspect of any conversation. So it's one thing to be like, okay, I have these strengths. It's another to be able to actually translate it and articulate it in a way where it's like, this is actually the value that I can bring to you, right? So what does that process actually look like? How do you identify what value they're looking for and what you can actually articulate to kind of help them understand what you bring to the table?
Well, I have to build trust very quickly, and demonstrating the tailored approach immediately builds that credibility. As well, I share my story with my clients because it really opens up communication. It does build trust, and then from there, we can connect and relate on it, and therefore we can build a deeper, more representative picture for you as the client.
Okay. And as for that strengths piece, so how do you like, is there like a self-reflection? Like, let's just say assessments aside, someone can't afford to do that, but then they can actually sit there and have some self-reflection questions. What are some questions that you ask, maybe 1 to 3, that would be like, hey, like now that's how you identify your strengths?
What do you think you're good at? Start there. And then have you always done that, right? When you were a kid with your friend group, for example. And why? Why do you think you're good at that? Why do you want to do that?
Okay. And let's just say, using the example, like I've always been the one that brought people together, right? How does that then translate into the corporate world, or how that value creation looks like from an employer perspective? Because I think that's the one thing that a lot of people have challenges with, is like, how do I package it based on the questions that you answered into the value that I bring to an employer?
I think part of it is trying to think like the employer. And in an interview, they're sitting there thinking, great, you can do this, but what's in it for me? Right. And then the other side of it is we start to anticipate their needs. We will look analytically at the company, at their activity, and say, here's where I notice they could use some assistance, and my strengths are the answer to how to do so.
Okay, so if you're on an employer's website or you're on their social media, maybe you're lucky enough to have an informational interview with someone from their company, how do you begin to assess what it is that they potentially need without straight up asking, so what keeps you up at night?
I think you start to understand, right? Ask questions that are going to allude to their motivation, number one. And you know what? Prove you've done your research. Say, look, I saw this. Would it be accurate to say that there could be an opportunity to enhance these processes to make it more efficient? It's the specifics. Proving we've done some research is a big one to build credibility and trust, as well as you can ask specific questions because it's going to give you a detailed piece of information as an answer. What's the difference between what's the company culture like? And it's a couple of things people love about being here. What's the couple challenges facing the overall staff?
I appreciate that. And let's switch gears a little bit into because you mentioned earlier about interviewing prep, resume, and LinkedIn, right? Really setting people up for success that way. So maybe let's start with LinkedIn. What's one piece of advice that you would offer people, like when it comes to having a LinkedIn that is actually strong versus, I don't think you're ever going to get any attention on that potentially because you're not really communicating the value that you bring?
One of them, I would say, that about section is not just about your career. That is about you as a whole person. And I think that really matters. I think the background image actually is a great chance to message part of who you are, and it's underutilized. And the other thing we can do in LinkedIn is we can add presentations, videos, podcasts, blogs, links to things. It's like an interactive workbook of you. And I think it is a platform that supplements core resumes very nicely.
Let's double click on that about section real quick, because you did mention, hey, like, you know what, it's more than just about what you bring from a career perspective, right? It's a little bit of a glimpse into you. So maybe what's a piece of advice you'd offer to tailor, like incorporate the advice that you just said without triggering potential unconscious biases that would come back at you?
So like I said before, it's really about explaining your perspective. So stating this is my value to an employer, this is my passion for what I want to do, and this is what I do outside of it, right? And it doesn't have to be emotional or too detailed in the personal, but it could say, I'm a great wife, I love spending time with my family, and that you would never have on a resume, but it's still telling you more about me as a person.
And now switching gears to the resume piece, because that's another common tool that we use in seeking work. So maybe what's one best practice that you could offer based on like the hundreds of resumes that you've been able to help people with?
Best practice. In terms of mechanics, it's how to beat applicant tracking systems. It's down to formatting and it takes some work. In terms of value forward, those accomplishment statements are the key. If it's something that's going to be an expectation of anyone in the role, it's probably not something we need to include. Or if you do, maybe in a job scope statement, but those accomplishments should be reserved for things that we did uniquely. And you must present it in terms of results, right? Because that's another demonstration of value. So it's the difference between completed monthly reporting consistently and consistently produced monthly reports, optimized reporting procedures, enabling more strategy and better decision making. It's that full piece that will show the value.
Love that you used a qualitative example right there, because most times when we're taught to write resumes, you need to be able to quantify everything, right, in terms of results. But sometimes it's actually not possible to quantify, especially if you don't remember the data. So the way that you just package that is something that I really hope people are able to take away, where you're still effectively able to articulate a result without having to quantify it. So now let's switch gears into the interview piece, right? Maybe what are, like, if you could offer the average job seeker 1 to 3 interview tips that you're like, hey, this will help you nail it, what would that look like?
Well, one, I know this is something that you talk about outside of this podcast. It's the tell me about yourself piece. It's really, this is my value. This is where it started, and this is where I want to take it. Another would be strategic. We have times where we can shape the direction of the conversation. So listen to respond, because that's going to help you. And then the last piece, I think, is to really be yourself. Right. Bring in genuine questions. If someone asks you something that maybe catches you off guard, write it down and they come back to it, because it demonstrates thought and care and a lot of great qualities while giving you an advantage to answer it the best you can. So that's the last thing I think is important.
I appreciate that. And I think one of the common challenges that I've heard from people when in an interview is like, how do I reframe something that is negative, right? Because you don't want to come off as like, oh yeah, like I got into an argument with someone. Like there's definitely ways of articulating things, right? So for you, if you're like, hey, maybe someone got laid off, they don't want to go into all the details, but they want to be able to effectively communicate why they're sitting across the table now for another interview. What would that conversation look like?
You have one of 3 options. In the parting of ways in less than ideal thing, I would state what I learned from it and how I'm improving it going forward. In the case where there's a question and it's not actually applicable to you and your story, state a hypothetical scenario. If there's something where we want to avoid negative association, my last piece of advice is to state it as an ideal, and then be prepared, that there might be a follow-up question down the path you don't want to go, so have a question ready, right? It's a dovetail.
That hypothetical situation that you just mentioned just now, I think is so key, because it also gives like the interviewer a chance to understand your thought process, right? That problem solving piece, so instead of just saying, I don't know, and then leaving it there. And then I also appreciate how you're like, you know what, this is what I learned from the past situation, without going too much into, man, this is the parts that all sucked about it, right? Because it just really changes the tone of the interview in itself. And then I guess, so we have the resume, the LinkedIn, and the interview piece. Now, when it comes to transferable skills, I think that's another common challenge that people have in one of the tools, right, that they need to prepare for the interview in the next role. How do you even begin identifying what are transferable skills and then communicating that in this as a so what to the new employer?
I think it's understanding this is how you show up in every single situation. And without realizing it in the past, you were doing it, So I've asked people, did you do this in your friend group? And sometimes they say no, but then they think about it and they come back and say, actually, I think it was there. I just didn't know that's what it was. So it's really about how you show up in any situation. Community groups, friend groups, workplaces, outside, inside. It doesn't matter, because it's you. It's who you are at your core. And then how can I use that to help someone else? That's how it benefits the employer.
And are there any common transferable skills that you've noticed is applicable to all industries? For example, for myself, I'm like, customer service is customer service wherever you go, right? If you provide great experiences for the end user, that's going to serve you well, right? Like for you though, have you noticed maybe 1 to 3 things that you're like, yeah, like these are the things that you may be able to highlight, because I've noticed it's transferable everywhere?
Problem solving, as boring as it sounds, it's extremely high level. You didn't have to dig deep of each person as to what aspect, but it shows up everywhere. Analytical thought, I think, is a big one. And then usually a mentorship piece. Some it's coaching, some it's leadership, some it's commanding. It depends, but there is a guidance portion as well, especially the further into a career one is.
Say more about that guidance mentorship piece, as in you have the ability to be a mentor and guide people.
I think it naturally emerges, right? When people say, oh, I love learning, and then they want to be the subject matter expert, and you dig into why, and then they say, well, I like being a go-to person, or I like doing the training so others don't have to. Or in terms of, like you said, customer service, maybe it's engagement with customer relations, maybe it's within your own team. The more engagement you have, the more efficient and effective work you get.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, I like to ask this of all my guests, right? When it comes to unleashing potential, what would you say is the first thing that comes to mind for the following question? What does it take to unleash the potential of individuals or organizations?
The first thing that comes to mind is honesty. Being real with yourself, being real with a company to say, this is legitimately what is going to bring us success, bare bones, nothing fancy, and then working towards it.
That's a great call. And I think it ties into what you talked about a little bit earlier in terms of listening, right? Because if you don't listen, you can't get that honesty either, right? So,
Yes.
and my last question to you is, what is one thing you're working on that you're excited about right now?
I just launched my website, Illumination Career Development. You're right, it's private coaching. So I've had people approach me already, even before it was live, to, I want to build my brand, or I really want to get this job. How can we make my resume as close as possible? And I'm just excited to help people with their specific needs in there.
Well, thank you so much, Hayley, for sharing your insights and everything. And congratulations on the launch of your website. That's always exciting. And you've made such a positive impact on both myself and a lot of my cohort members that I've been able to speak with. And so I'm excited to keep in touch with you and see what you'll do. And to everyone else who's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more than you'll know. And I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.